What kind of image of Kyrgyzstan do you produce?
I think if you look at the images in the exhibition, there are a little bit two sides of it. I think that one side is the very embroidered kind of historical feel to it, where we really portray their fascination and love for their storytelling and storytelling history and like the big epics. And the other side is something a little bit, it's the personal side, but it's also maybe where Kyrgyzstan is right now as a country, because it has come out of the Soviet Union. So when we were there in 2006, it was like on the brink of what's going to happen now. They were waiting for 5 years for the Soviet Union to kind of come back, and then they understood it's not going to come back. So we have to kind of create our new identity, our own identity, and that partly they find we found that they returned to a lot of their old traditions. So this we show also with the images. And on the other hand, it's this search for and the insecurity that comes when something old ends and something new begins. It's kind of like, that's why the fall, like the autumn feeling, a little bit the melancholy of something is ending, and at the same time kind of a young country, or not a young country, but something new is about to happen, and it's not clear yet where that's going to go.
Nina and I are using very modern techniques, but at the same time we're using a very old inspiration source and combining that. And you could say Kyrgyzstan is like that. Like what you said, that Kyrgyzstan, it's a country that has a very old tradition, also under the Soviet times, and is now, I mean, if you look at the turmoil that has happened most recently, it's on the cusp of something. And I think it's these two kind of breaking points together, which is what it is today. And I would say the imagery we feel is also these two sort of breaking points, the modern techniques, but the old reflections combined with the tradition of the stories, with the actual people that we meet, and then the embroidery, and then the kind of melancholy and color palette of it all. That and the sort of visual, luscious experience, that all together, I think, embodies what we experience there.
Your work is much like anthropological studies of this foreign people and foreign country. Have you reflected on that fact that you have a Western way of seeing this, and how that affects your portrayals of these people and of this culture?
It's a fantastic question, because I think it's a dilemma in a sense. It's also, if you look at our inspiration, this kind of this fascination of going to a foreign place, and also what you're actually doing, and what you're actually asking from these people. It can have a sort of a romantic value to it, and how what does that all mean? Something that Nina and I were thinking about, because I think we're also a product of our generation. Nowadays, you can travel in the world in a kind of internet way. You can Google places and you can discover places, and actually do projects on the entire world in a way where you think you know what you're talking about. And I think it's created a kind of laziness, in a sense, of understanding the world order. And when the methods that we're using that are kind of inspired from very old styles and very old techniques, in a sense, the beginnings of the old photo studios and the interview methods, was, in our way, we felt that it actually comes closer to maybe the authenticity of what we're researching and what we're trying to understand. So in that way, I would say it's, yes, we're coming from a Western point of view, but we're trying to maybe create a little bit more genuine document and understandability of what we're experiencing.
So what inspired you to portray Kyrgyzstan?
I know that when Nina and I started working together about 6 years ago, and when we started to formulate the project and sort of this stomach feeling, this urge to do the work that we do today, we started to look at maybe the authenticity of where it's coming from. And I think there we realized that it actually had to do with more our past and something as innate as where we come from and the heritage that we grow up with. And that's how it sort of all began, because I think now when we look at it, it's very obvious that this is the inspiration. But it took a while to understand this. And so it began with us sort of, comparing stories. And so I, for example, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In our home, we have many artworks and pictures on the walls, every home does. But specific to the home that I grew up in, we had images, black and white images, of a man on a horseback in Wyoming, a group of Native American Indians, a regiment of people standing in front of a field. And my mother then started to tell me the stories behind these images. And these, in fact, were images related to my family history. That was my great-great-grandfather Campbell on the wall. It was him on horseback on the expedition for President Arthur. And through that, she started to tell me like adventures. These were fantastic stories, you know, on the edge of your bed stories, listening to my mother tell this. And then on the back of these images was a text. And I think that when I started to realize that this was a very interesting idea of that a story being told to me, then actually having an image there that described it along with the text. And then Nina then talking to me about her stories, it became something that was a huge inspiration shelf for us.
And it's like a little bit like Sarah said also, when we met over this common inspiration that we started to really formulate and go in to also later our working method. And it's also this fascination of when you hear a story about a place and how much more intimate the place becomes for you in your memory, and also how much more you relate to that place. And I remember growing up in Austria, and my grandparents, they had a farm, and I was there as a child during the summers and during vacations. And my grandmother was the most fantastic storyteller. And so she could tell a story with this vigor that you really could kind of smell how it smelled in her classroom 60 years ago. And she remembered all the names and all the words, and she remembered all the events. And there could be just like a single tree on a little hilltop, and she would be 60 years ago on this hilltop, it happened like that. And from that moment on, this hilltop was connected with the story, even though I hadn't experienced that. So this kind of like power of the storytelling and what it can really do to your own experience of a place was fascinating, and we still use that concept a lot in our work.
I think that's sort of like visualizing, like that. I mean, right as you're telling me that, I start to visualize an image, and I think these images that Nina and I start to visualize, this sort of common language, is the result of us being sort of fascinated by sitting and listening to a great story. And us then creating an image from that is it's irresistible. And I think that's then when we realize this is what we need to do.
It would be interesting to know how you work. How do you go about when you try to portray something you know nothing about?
Nina and I, if we go back to our inspiration, was the stories. And I think there is something so authentic about, it tells you so much about a person when you hear a story about maybe something that had happened to them or something that had happened within maybe the folklore that surrounds them. And so as a result, we thought that let's use that. So it starts off with, tell me a story.
So instead of asking, tell me something about yourself, you
exactly.
ask, tell me a story.
Exactly. It's also, it's a wonderful method because it kind of gives you the opportunity to break the ice. People don't feel exposed. They're just telling you a story.
That's not necessarily about them.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
But that, on the other hand, can really tell you something about them anyways, because they choose what story they want to tell you. So through that method, we really get people engaged and also open up, and you get to know them. You get to know them in a way that that doesn't scare them.
Mm-hmm. And then after we get this story, and like for example in Kyrgyzstan we were up in the village, we had an interpreter, and she would ask around a little bit about who kind of was the town historian, and so we would sit and have an interview, and then we would also transcribe this interview in a notebook. And as we started to gather these stories, and also back to our inspiration, was the combination of image. And so Nina and I decided to use a traveling photo studio. And this is a studio that both her and I could have on our back and easily travel with, a very light studio. And we would then set up the studio in a field, in a home, or whatever it was, and then ask people that we met in the town if they could help us reenact these stories that we were told.
So it's actually a lot about their own engagement. You can say it's the opposite of documentary. Everything is staged, but only through their own engagement, what they bring and how also they interpret the story and our directions that we give them.
Does that mean that they decide what to wear and how to pose and where to stand, or do you direct?
I think it's for us it's always been important that we don't photograph anybody on the spot. So we ask them first, we explain a little bit, and we would schedule maybe the photo shoot for the next day. And we would also say, because what we don't want is them being themselves in the first place. We want them to act in one of their stories, and then their personality comes through anyways. And also, so to refer to the question about the clothes and which kind of clothes they wear, is that we would give them more ideas of what they could bring, but it's always their clothes or clothes they have loaned somewhere, or clothes they bring and they choose, and then we.
A very typical thing we would say is, do you have something from your grandmother that she wore when she was your age? And a lot of times, especially in these small isolated places, they have these things. So they come in character. And I think also back to what Nina said is the interesting way of how when a person is not threatened by having to be themselves, and the stage fright that can create. And when they are, well, I'm just being a jar, or whatever character we would give them. In the end, what we are really photographing is them. And I think it's a way of kind of getting closer, I think, to your subject, and an authenticity that can come through that method. And
once you've taken the pictures, what happens next? When you come back to your studio?
Exactly. Well, first we take all these pictures during the weeks of our travel, and then we would come back with thousands of images that we go through and look through, and we would then decide one more time which character, because then you have the overview really. You have traveled, you have been there, you have gathered all this material, and you have the overview, and sometimes later on maybe we realize that a character we actually photographed for one story fits better into another story because of the day of the shooting, or because of what we learned of that person later on. So there is a lot of, we take a lot of freedom in that process as well, because what's
in
really...
what way?
To have a concept to follow and rules, but not, but to be a little bit more flexible, so that in the end the most important thing is that it is right in the end, and it's not because you said it would be something from the beginning.
But
things can happen on the
practical way. You do a lot of digital work on the images. Tell me about that. And you make collages, and you really change the original raw footage a lot.
You could say that what we're gathering, so we have all of these stories, then we also have the experiences of what happened, because sometimes the interview will go over into a personal, something that really happened to this person. So it's a combination of folklore, and it's a combination of what really happened when we were there. And then we come back, and we then try and then create, you could say, a lineage of imagery that speaks what we have seen. And
You can say kind of like the ultimate image that tells it all.
Yeah.
It's like the condensed impression
Right.
of the person and the story, all these different layers
Yeah.
in one.
Mm.
Sometimes it's already there in the image we take,
Mm.
and sometimes it's not there because it was impossible to, because it
Exactly.
happened not at the same time. It
Mm.
happened, one thing happened afterwards, but still matters for the image.
Mhm.
So then that's why all these layers in our images, sometimes more and sometimes less.
And I think that can be as a result of an image that is almost borderline, like it could almost look like a painting, like a surrealistic view of something that was told. Other times it's pure documentation. And that's why sometimes images are completely torn apart and other times completely left unhandled, you could say,
Mm.
as we saw it there.